Well, Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and we just welcome you to another teaching here on the Last Supper in the Gospel account. Kim is going to be teaching with me today. We are really happy about that. There are two parts to this study. You're going to find out what they are if you've never seen them before. But today it is what kind of bread was at this Last Supper. That's what we want to find out. And again, it is a teaching from Yah's covenant calendar. And the approximate date is Abib in the year of the crucifixion. We have a teaching on that as well. So the Last Supper, there are two parts to this teaching. You don't have to watch one of them first or second. Either one can be interchanged here. But part one, we're going to be doing that a little bit later. Part one is the controversy over the date of the Last Supper. Was it Abib 13 or 14? Well, we discovered in part one that it was Abib 13 and not 14, but there was something else about that. The Last Supper was not the Passover meal, so we're going to look at that in detail coming up soon. We're calling this part two in this particular study, and it's the controversy over the bread. Which bread was representing Yahusha's body? What kind of bread was at this supper table? Was it leavened or unleavened? And there has been questions over this topic over many, many years. Just like I have right here. Was the bread at the Last Supper table leavened or unleavened? Or both? Were both kinds of bread at that table on that night? There's going to be three witnesses that we'll be looking at in detail. Number one will be Luke and the Emmaus account. What was happening there on a unleavened bread day. Number two witness is going to be John and the Second Supper table. That's very interesting because only John records this information. It is not found in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. John is always a little bit different. Don't forget about that. And number three, we're going to look at some patterns of type and antitype. Now, for those of you that are not sure about these words, type and antitype, type is the pattern, okay? It is the pattern that Yahusha has to fill. So just as an example, in Exodus 12, the Passover lamb would have been the type or the shadow. And when Yahusha comes to fulfill his part of this plan of salvation, he is the antitype. He crosses out the type. He's the one that replaces the type with the true. So you have a shadow and a true. So we're just going to look a little bit about type and antitype for just a little bit of an extra nugget there. But first of all, we want to do a thorough examination of the Greek word for bread, because we find this Last Supper is right in the New Testament. So Kim is going to be helping me with the sunshine slides.
Okay, so there is a question with this controversy. Can the type of bread used at the Last Supper be the item that will settle the controversy of whether or not the Last Supper was on Abib 13, or if indeed the Last Supper was eaten on Passover or Abib 14? And that was the question. And the arguments we have are, if the bread was leavened, then the meal cannot qualify for the Passover meal eaten on Abib 14, where it is commanded to eat the unleavened bread. And number two, the second argument, if the bread is leavened, then the last possible date for the Last Supper would have to be Abib 13. And what if? So are those the two arguments? And what if there is another option that we can consider that we really don't know about? And that is what we're going to look at today in this study.
So the first thing we're going to do is look at the word bread in Hebrew and Greek. And there's going to be a lot of review about this because we want to be sure that we understand these terms from the original language. The Hebrew word for bread is lechem. You'll find it there in the Strongs at 3899, and it says lechem from 3898. Food. for man or beast. And then it says, especially bread or grain for making the bread. And the King James will also use these other words, showbread, eat, food and fruit, and loaf, okay, or meat and victuals. Now, loaf, we think of a loaf as something that's been leavened. The Greek word for bread is artos, and it goes along here with bread at G 740. You're going to see these numbers a lot in the first half of this presentation. It says from G 142, bread, look at this, as raised, or a loaf. And it also can use showbread or loaf in the King James. So a raised loaf of bread is basically what the Greek is saying. Now, there is a Greek word for unleavened. It is azumos. Unleavened, it's G106, quite a different number from G740, okay? And it says from G1 and G2219, unleavened. Figuratively, uncorrupted. Especially by implication, the Passover week. And then the King James will say unleavened and referring to unleavened bread as well. But I want you to note that in the Greek text, azumos is never used in conjunction with the bread, but it is only used when identifying the festival of unleavened bread. That's an important thing to remember. The Hebrew portion of this study is also very important. Why? Because the New Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek for the Gentiles that could not read the Hebrew text and anybody else. Now, there are different types of unleavened bread in the scriptures. 3 different types that you will find are unleavened bread, unleavened wafers, and unleavened cakes. But today we're going to address mostly unleavened bread. We will talk about these other 3 just very, very lightly. Different qualities between leavened and unleavened bread. I think everybody knows about this, but let's just go through it. The account given through Matthew, Mark, and Luke says Yahusha broke bread. And this detail should not be overlooked. Leavened bread is not broken. That beautiful loaf there, it's not broken. It must be torn to share it with others if you're not going to cut it with a knife. And by the way, I think it tastes better if you just tear it off. But unleavened bread, or matzah, it cannot be torn. It is broken. For these 3 gospel messages, the context alone declares that Yahusha broke unleavened matzah bread to serve to his 12 disciples. Well, what about breaking bread? Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record that Yahusha broke bread. But John does not mention this detail. He talks about dipping sop, a deliberate action to include only Judas, who was sitting next to him. Was this a cultural courtesy? Well, C. Tenney in the Expositor's Bible Commentary has something to say about that. He says, for the host, and this would have been Yahusha, to select such a tidbit from the main dish and give it to a guest would be a mark of courtesy and esteem. The disciples, seeing this, would conclude only that Yahusha regarded Judas as a friend he had confidence in. This was a very special note to everyone else without saying a single word that there's courtesy and esteem being established here.
So what about dipping bread, this dipping bread? The qualities of unleavened bread and leavened bread differ when it comes to dipping. And further to that, John records that this bread was dipped. It was dipped until it was sopping wet. And when unleavened bread is totally immersed in the unleavened drink, oil, or a sauce, it does not soak up or absorb too much of the dip. But leavened bread, when it is totally immersed in the unleavened drink, oil, or a sauce, it absorbs the dip very quickly and it becomes sopping wet, as we would say. So what do we know for sure about this night? Well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke do give us clarity on two facts. One, that Yahusha broke bread at the table of the Last Supper. And they also mention that there was a betrayer amidst the group. And the question is, how is the betrayer identified? And there is more information that is of utmost importance for this study. And we are going to look at this. We're going to gather all the information and then assemble the information in the correct order, and then we'll be able to form the conclusion. Leavened versus unleavened. So in an attempt to determine whether the Last Supper was a Passover meal or not, many evangelicals today focus on the issue of whether the bread of the Last Supper was leavened or unleavened. In fact, some say that if the bread was unleavened, then the Last Supper qualifies for the Passover meal. However, you know that the opposite can also be true, that if the bread was leavened, then the Last Supper could not have been the Passover meal. And most equate the bread with the meal. But what about equating the bread with Yahusha? So we want to review now some definitions.
So reviewing the Strong's definitions for bread, in the Old Testament, it is lechem. I'll give you these again. 38.99 lechem. It says especially bread and a loaf. But don't forget, showbread is there as well. And in the Greek, it is artos, G740. It merely says bread as raised or a loaf. And then it's got showbread. It doesn't have any other options that it says it could be unleavened bread. There is nothing in either of these definitions that indicates that the bread is always unleavened. In fact, both definitions kind of lean towards the leavened type of bread in both the Hebrew and the Greek. And now we come to a serious question. Because leaven, for most of us, we know that leaven usually is related to sin most often, okay? Most often, not all the time. So how can leavened bread represent our sinless Yahusha? If leaven always represents sin, how can it represent Yahusha? There's things to remember for this study. Because the Greek and the Hebrew definitions may seem vague right now, there cannot be absolute clarity through that single option of using those definitions. We need to have a deeper study of Scripture that is necessary to determine the answer to our question that we've been asking. Is it also necessary to, it is also necessary to remember grammatical context of the passages. We need to remember the scriptural patterns for the terms leavened and unleavened, and how these terms would link to the type, which is the shadow picture, and the antitype, which is the true. So the shadow picture points to our Messiah, and our Messiah is the one that is the true pattern. What are the patterns? Leaven in the scriptures most often represents sin. But leaven can also represent the change in the growth necessary to be fit for the kingdom of heaven, and unleavening as representing the ridding oneself of sin. So next, we're going to have an examination of 5 different sections that apply these scriptural definitions and the grammatical content and contexts and the patterns. Might be a little bit hard to slug through this, but we need to go through these 5 different sections. Well, what are they? In this part of the study, we're going to compare the Hebrew and the Greek definitions for this English word bread in an attempt to determine whether the bread is leavened or unleavened, or both, for these following categories. We're going to talk about the manna, the sanctuary showbread. We'll talk about the consecration bread for the Aaronic priesthood. We will also talk about the loaves of Pentecost and the breaking of bread in the account of the Emmaus walk on that wave sheaf day. This search should provide a foundation for the type of bread that was used at the Last Supper. And then we're going to be ready to examine the gospel account and the bread used for the Last Supper. That's going to be the most interesting part, the last half. But we need to do our homework first. So the first part is the manna. It was called bread from heaven. The following information is going to be based on reasonable assessments that the manna given in the wilderness for 40 years was not leavened. We are going to leave that as a reasonable assessment. This bread represented the Messiah that was to come. Why? Because his life would not be leavened with any sin of his own. And everyone is to partake of his perfect life. Therefore, it seems reasonable to assume that the manna was completely unleavened. But can this assessment be really that final? What do you think? Well, let's look at manna as bread in the Old Testament, and then we'll look at it in the New Testament. And Kim's going to read these scriptures.
Okay, so we'll start here with the first mention of manna in Exodus 16:4. Then said Yahuwah unto Moses, Behold, I will rain bread, that's lechem, from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them whether they will walk in my law or no. And then in verse 15, and when the children of Israel saw it, they said one to another, It is manna. That is 4478. What is it? It is manna, for they wist not what it was. And Moses said unto them, This is the bread, lechem, which Yahuwah has given you to eat. And the Hebrew for manna, when you look it up, is literally a whatness, so to speak. It's a question. What is it? What is this? And the Hebrew definitions for 3899 bread and H4478 for manna, they do not specify if the manna is leavened or unleavened. However, we know that ordinary bread is leavened.
Okay, so we're ready to do our little summary for the Hebrew manna. What did we find? The Hebrew does not give absolute clarity if the manna was unleavened. So we need to look at the scriptural patterns. Do they give us clarity using type and antitype comparisons? The manna was a type and it represents Yahusha, who is the antitype. It represents Yahusha as the bread of life, having no sin of his own. Therefore, the scriptural pattern for both type and antitype links to the unleavened concept. This pattern allows for the reasonable assessment that the manna was unleavened.
So manna as bread in the New Testament. Let's see what John has to say. He talks about manna. Our fathers did eat manna in the desert, as it is written. He gave them bread, that's artos, from heaven to eat. And here in the Greek, manna is 3131. It's described as an edible gum. It doesn't really tell us much here. In John 6, the Greek word for bread or artos is used when referring to manna from heaven as the lechem bread. And here the manna is definitely compared to a leavened type of bread using the Greek. The comparison of manna to lechem was not that specific as the Greek word artos was for leavened bread. So I want you to remember there is no Greek term for unleavened bread, only feast of unleavened bread.
So we're all ready to do our summary for the Greek word manna. And what is it? The Greek appears to give absolute clarity that the manna was leavened. Would the scriptural patterns for type and antitype in the New Testament be different than what we found in the Old Testament? You know, the concept of leavened manna, it seems to break down here, doesn't it? It appears that that pattern has been severely disrupted. So under this premise, is it safe to assume that the manna was leavened, saying that the New Testament Greek definitions take precedence over the type and antitype comparisons that we found in the Hebrew? And just another note, the New Testament is a translation of the Hebrew into Greek. In many cases, the Greek translation fails to give the full Hebrew concept. So we have to be careful when we're looking at the Greek. That's the first section. So the second section now is going to be looking at the showbread. We've done the manna. We're going to look at the showbread for section number 2. The 12 loaves of showbread in the holy place of the sanctuary also represent the Messiah as the bread of life. He was continuously in the presence of his Father. The week-old bread was replaced on Sabbath with freshly baked loaves. On Sabbath, everyone, is when they baked that showbread. And to us, it seems that the showbread would have to be unleavened or spoil before it was eaten a week later by the priests in the holy place. It sat there for a whole week before they would eat it. However, the presence of the Father can easily preserve leavened bread in the holy place, just as the pot of manna was preserved for decades inside the Ark of the Covenant. So the question is, do the scriptures clarify the status of the showbread? And remember, showbread is a combination of 2 words, and there's going to be 2 Hebrew definitions when we look at it. I would also like you just to look at this picture. Did the showbread look like this in this picture? Or was it 12 flat matzah to provide food for the full course of priests each and every week?
So showbread in the Old Testament. Let's take a look at Exodus 35:13. The table and his staves and all his vessels and the showbread. And that's made up of 2 words, 64:40, presence, and 38:99, lechem. So we'll look up first. When we look up showbread, we see for show, 64:40, panim. It is a plural word, but always a singular, meaning the face, or as the part that turns. And the second part of that phrase or word is 38:99, lechem. And we've already looked at this, especially bread, loaf, grain. An example here, the showbread faces the presence of the Holy One in the sanctuary. And it's also known as the bread of the presence. So as with the manna, the showbread links back to the same Hebrew word, lechem, which can indicate, remember, either leavened or unleavened bread. So soon it is going to be shown that lechem, as that general term is used for bread, it has to be qualified with the specific term. It has to have a qualifier with the specific term of either unleavened matzah to be actually unleavened bread. And we're going to take a look at these qualifiers.
That qualifier word is really important. So we're ready to do our summary now for this Hebrew word of showbread. It's a summary, just one slide, and then we're going to get into the showbread in the New Testament. What have we found? The Hebrew does not give absolute clarity that the showbread had to be unleavened. Number 2, about the scriptural patterns. It might give clarity using type and antitype comparisons. As with the manna, the showbread, which is the type, and represents Yahusha as the antitype, as the bread of life, having no sin of his own, but being continually in the presence of the Father. Therefore, the scriptural pattern for both type and antitype, it seems to link very strongly to the concept of unleavened showbread. What about this pattern? This pattern can allow for a reasonable assessment that the showbread was unleavened, even though the definition for lechem leans towards leavened bread. But we're going to see if this assessment really holds up or not.
So we'll take a look at showbread in the New Testament. Hebrews speaks of the sanctuary showbread as seen in Exodus. And as with the manna, the showbread also links to this word artos, indicating either leavened or unleavened bread. And even though artos can be leavened bread, this does not mean, though, that the sanctuary showbread had to be leavened bread. And there will be two Greek definitions here. Again, Hebrews 9:2, for there was a tabernacle made, the first wherein was the candlestick and the table and the showbread. So G4286, prothesis, and then we'll look at G740, artos, that's showbread, the two words, which is called the sanctuary. And so the first part, 4286, prothesis, from G4388, it is a setting forth, or specifically the showbread in the temple as exposed before Yahuwah. And the King James Version uses showbread, purpose. And the second part here is artos, as a raised loaf, raised or as a loaf. King James Version, showbread.
Okay, we're going to continue on with the showbread in the New Testament. Just as leaven can represent either the leaven of sin or leaven for the kingdom of heaven, so too the showbread could have represented the varied spiritual conditions of Israel over the millennium. Many times in the Old Testament, Israel was in rebellion, completely leavened by the ways of the surrounding pagan nations. Any bread or meal offerings that attended the blood sacrifices on the altar of burnt offering had to be unleavened. There was no indication they could ever put a leavened offering on the altar of burnt offering. However, the showbread was never offered on the altar of burnt offering, but it was always eaten by the priests in the holy place. So beware of comparisons that use the example of unleavened grain offerings upon the altar of burnt offering as the dictated rule that the showbread has to always be unleavened. This would be an acceptable rule if showbread was offered on the altar of burnt offering. And I want you to note that the grain offerings were always in the courtyard, and the showbread was always contained in the holy place. So there is a question to ponder. Could this showbread also represent two different mandates of Yahusha, not just Israel? Well, let's do our summary for the Greek showbread. The Greek appears to give absolute clarity of leavened showbread, just like it did with the manna. Again, with the scriptural patterns for type and antitype in the New Testament, would they be different than that of the Old Testament? The concept of leavened showbread seems to break down if we hold to the idea that showbread was always unleavened because it represents the sinless life of Yahusha. Number two, it appears that the pattern has been severely disrupted. And under this premise, is it safe to assume that the showbread was leavened, saying that the New Testament Greek definitions take precedence over the Hebrew definitions, following the same pattern as the manna? Well, so far, there does not seem to be a specific scriptural guideline for the showbread. It is quite possible and logical that the showbread was either leavened or unleavened, as can be understood from a further study.
Okay, so now we're on to our third section, looking for clarity. We'll take a look at the consecration bread for priesthood. In Exodus 29 and Leviticus 8, Moses was divinely directed to transfer his priestly duties to Aaron and his sons under the Aaronic priesthood. And we remember that that's what was to happen after the golden calf, right? And part of the ceremony included the use of three different types of unleavened bread called unleavened bread, unleavened cakes, unleavened wafers. anything to do with being unleavened is matzah. Exodus 29:2. And unleavened, that's matzah, bread, lechem, and cakes unleavened, tempered with oil, and wafers unleavened, anointed with oil, of wheaten flour shalt thou make them. And then in verse 23, and one loaf of bread, lechem, and one cake of oiled bread, and one wafer out of the basket of the unleavened bread, matzah, that is before Yahuwah. And thou shalt put all in the hands of Aaron and in the hands of his sons, and shalt wave them for a wave offering before Yahuwah. And thou shalt receive them of their hands and burn them upon the altar for a burnt offering, for a sweet savor before Yahuwah. So are you noticing that the unleavened in all of this is matzah? And it's a qualifier.
So this consecration bread in the Old Testament, only in the Old Testament. We do not find it in the New Testament. It is always unleavened bread every single time. Did you see those qualifiers? Unleavened matzah. It's not soured or bittered with yeast. It's unfermented, an unfermented cake or a loaf, especially for the festival of Passover, because there was no leaven used for the week of unleavened bread. Bread, remember, is lechem. It is a food for man or beast, but especially bread or grain. And remember, it's got that loaf in there. Loaf. A loaf is raised. So just a note on consecration bread, all of the following were unleavened, or they were matzah, and all three types of unleavened product were in one basket of unleavened bread. The bread was called lechem, especially bread. The cakes were challah, like a cake, and the wafers rakik, like a thin cake or a wafer.
All three grain products for the consecration of the priests are noted again as lechem. The Hebrew definition does seem to indicate none of the grain items are unleavened unless qualified by the term unleavened or matzah. So subsequently, every reference to manna, bread, cakes, wafers, or showbread cannot be understood as unleavened if matzah is absent. And there is no New Testament counterpart for the use of unleavened bread, cakes, and wafers for the consecration of priests to an earthly sanctuary priesthood. So you're not going to find anything there. Why? Because we know Yahusha is now our high priest of the Melchizedek order, and his sinless life links directly to and it fulfills any unleavened item, be it grain or drink offerings.
So we're ready for the summary for the Hebrew word for consecration bread. The Hebrew gives absolute clarity that the consecration bread, cakes, and wafers were unleavened, and they were taken from the basket of unleavened bread. These unleavened grain items were waved heavenward before being laid on the altar of burnt offering. Remember, in Exodus 23:18, leaven of any sort was never placed on this altar, and no sweetness either. Scriptural patterns do give clarity using type and antitype comparisons this time. And as with the manna and the showbread, the unleavened consecration breads, which is the type, once again represent Yahusha as the antitype, as our bread of life. Having no sin of his own, his perfect life was laid on the altar, at that stake as an offering of a sweet savor to the Father. Definitely, the scriptural pattern for both the type and the antitype links strongly to the concept of unleavened consecrated breads. So, there is no doubt regarding the leavening aspect, as the clarity is completely verified through the use of the word unleavened 4682 matzah. There's no assumptions that are necessary at all. We for sure know that this is matzah unleavened product.
Okay, so category 4, let's take a look at the loaves of Pentecost. And notice the Hebrew word for loaves is also lechem, as with the manna, sanctuary showbread, and the consecration bread. However, this time the lechem is leavened bread, and it is qualified with that word, leaven. We read in Leviticus 23:17, "You shall bring out of your habitations 2 wave loaves," that's lechem, "of 2/10 deals. They shall be of fine flour. They shall be baken with leaven, chametz. They are the first fruits unto Yahuwah." Again, our review on bread, lechem, remember, food, especially bread or grain, fruit, loaf, meat or victuals. And then let's take a look at leaven, H2552, chametz. And that is a ferment. Notice, ferment. It is leavened.
Boy, that sounds pretty clear. Well, let's just finish up with our Hebrew summary for these Pentecost loaves. As with the consecration bread, the Hebrew again, it gives absolute clarity that the Pentecost loaves were leavened. Those 2 loaves of leavened bread were required and presented as a thank offering being waved heavenward. The first fruit sheaves of wheat had been consecrated in its natural state. The Pentecost loaves were from the new harvest of the wheat. It was ripe. It was reaped, threshed, ground to flour, leavened, and salted, kneaded, and baked, all by human hands. The scriptural patterns do give clarity using the type and antitype comparisons. The leavened type represents Yahusha as the great teacher. His life, mixed with the life of individuals, represents truth and spirit-filled people preaching the gospel for the kingdom of heaven. Only Yahusha's spirit-filled leaven can change the sinner to reflect him. And as with the consecration bread, there is no doubt regarding the leavening aspect, as the clarity is completely verified through the use of leavened chametz. And know what? No assumptions are necessary this time. Nothing at all. We have complete clarity. Continuing on with our Hebrew summary for these Pentecost loaves. Number 1, so far the Hebrew has shown us that lechem bread can be either leavened or unleavened. I hope you can see that. Number 2, if the lechem is not qualified with the terms matzah for unleavened bread or chametz for leavened bread, it cannot be said with exact certainty what type the lechem bread would be. So you have to have that qualifier. At that point, one would have to carefully consider the scriptural patterns. I'm talking about type and antitype. You actually have to consider that and or the context of a passage, which is exactly what has to be done in this next section. But first, let's go back to the showbread to consider some other options. Coming back to this showbread question. A review, number 1, the consecrated loaves for the Aaronic priests were unleavened, being qualified by the term matzah. The Pentecost loaves were leavened, being qualified by the term chametz. The 2 loaves of showbread in the holy place of the sanctuary represent the Messiah as the bread of life without sin. But his life was also given for the leaven of the kingdom of heaven. He stands continuously in the presence of the Father for this purpose. Now a question. Do the scriptures clarify the status of the showbread? And I have to say no. I haven't found the answer, yes or no. There is no qualifier for this showbread to be either leavened or unleavened. It just doesn't tell us. And again, that question, how would 12 flat matzah provide food for the full course of the priesthood for a complete week? There was a lot of priests that came in for their duties each session every 2 weeks, how would 12 flat loaves feed those priests, all of those priests? Just want you to remember that.
Okay, we're going to take a look at something from the Temple Institute here that was found in February of 2020. And it says that it was also discovered that each time the Hebrew word solet is used in Torah, it signified the method with which the flour was ground, and that is specifically as fine flour. And since Torah forbids the use of yeast in the Holy Temple, and now notice what the article goes on to say here, very interesting, other leavening agents were necessary. Almost sounds like this bread was raised or leavened. 40 minutes is required for the kneading process. So does unleavened bread need this much kneading? No. The bread is baked in large ovens, 40 centimeters by 80 centimeters, with 8-centimeter thick walls. Gemara relates that a reoccurring miracle guaranteed that the showbread remained fresh for 1 week from the day it was baked, without the need for closed storage or refrigeration. Remember, unleavened bread doesn't spoil like this. And this professor has a recipe for maintaining freshness for the duration of 1 week. He continues to say here, the shape of the bread is achieved by using baking forms as it was done in the Holy Temple. And 2 different shapes have been produced by Professor Amar. The conus shape, as depicted on ancient Hasmonean coins from the era of the Maccabees, and the shape known as tava prutza, the shape of an inverted Hebrew letter. And so the question is, are there any requirements, though, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread about what kind of showbread would have had to have been in the holy place of the sanctuary? If during that Feast of Unleavened Bread, right?
That's kind of an interesting comment there. I hope everybody caught that. Well, do we have any conclusions for the showbread? I'm asking a question here. The research that has been completed thus far is that the sanctuary showbread could have been unleavened, or the sanctuary showbread could have been leavened. Could have been either or. Depending on Yahusha's purpose, leavened or unleavened bread would be determined by the context. Now, if that is so, I would like you to ponder this question. What kind of bread would be placed in the holy place during the 7 days of the unleavened bread festival, which will usually include some cycles of 2 weeks? Would it be raised bread, matzah, or would there be a provision for both? Is there provision for this showbread to be either leavened or unleavened? And if it can be leavened, what kind of showbread is in the holy place during the festival of unleavened bread? And that's as far as we can go on the showbread. There's probably a lot more research that could be done. So that completes the introduction for the bread as used in the Hebrew and the Greek passages. But we have one more section to do. It's going to be included in this first witness for artos bread in Luke's gospel account of the Emmaus walk with Yahusha there in Luke 24. So section number 5, remember we said it would be, what about that bread in the Emmaus account? Up to this point, there is no doubt that the Greek word for bread, artos, can be used to describe either leavened or unleavened bread. In the account from Luke, context will be the determining factor for either leavened or unleavened bread. So we need to look at the context now. Well, there were 2 followers of Yahusha, and they decided to return to Emmaus the same day that they heard their master had risen. The events of this account occurred during the Passover festival. Let's read the main verses before charting the events.
Now, upon the first day of the week, and that is Abib 18, very early in the morning, they, the women with the spices, came unto the sepulchre, bringing the spices which they had prepared, and certain others with them. And they found the stone rolled away from the sepulchre, and they entered in and found not the body of Yahusha. He is not there, but is risen. Remember how he spake unto you when he was yet in Galilee, saying, the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and the third day rise again. And they remembered his words, and they returned from the sepulchre and told all these things that he was risen unto the 11 and to all the rest. And behold, two of them went that same day, again, Abib 18, to the village called Emmaus, which was from Jerusalem about 60 furlongs. And they talked together of all these things which had happened. And it came to pass that while they were communed together and reasoned, Yahusha himself drew near and went with them. And it came to pass, as he sat at meat with them, he took bread, artos. He took artos and blessed it and brake and gave to them. And their eyes were opened and they knew him. And he vanished out of their sight. And they told what things were done in the way and how he was known to them in the breaking of artos. So are you wondering about the use of this word artos here as leavened bread?
Well, let's look at these first 5 days of the Passover festival. We're only going to look at the 5 days. We're starting here with Yahusha's Passover and his death on the 4th day, the midst of the week. Okay, that would be Abib 14. It's day number 1 of 8. And then the day after that is going to be the unleavened bread convocation on Abib 15. And then we have the 6th day, the 6th cycle of the week, which is Friday. That is Abib 16. That was where they were preparing the spices. And then we have the weekly Shabbat on Abib 17 right here. It's day number 4 of 8. And then we're back to the first cycle of the week, which would have been first fruits. And this is where his ascension happens right here. And right here, number 2, this is what we're looking at. Yahusha joins the 2 travelers. This would be Abib 18. It's day number 5 of 8. So what are some facts for the Passover Spring Festival of this Emmaus account? Number 1, Abib 14 to 21 represents the 8 inclusive days for this festival. And I'm only showing you the first 5 days above. Abib 15 to Abib 21 represent the 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Only unleavened bread, cake, or wafers are eaten during these days. And that includes Abib 18, the first cycle of the week as wave sheaf. The women, the disciples, and others discover that their master is not in the tomb on Abib 18. And later on the same day in the evening, Yahusha meets up with the 2 disciples walking to Emmaus. Yahusha accepts their invitation to dine with them for the evening meal. They asked him 3 times, and on the 3rd invitation, he said yes. Number 5, when Yahusha broke the bread, that was artos, that is when they recognized him. This artos bread was definitely not leavened bread, as Abib 18 is exactly in the midst of the week of unleavened bread. And any Torah keeper and follower of Yahusha would not be serving leavened bread to their guests during the week of unleavened bread. However, the Greek word artos for bread in the New Testament is defined as leavened bread. What happened? Did these 2 disciples of Yahusha really serve him leavened bread during the week of unleavened bread? Number 7, we have already seen in previous examples that artos can have the dual meaning of leavened and or unleavened bread. In the Emmaus account, the artos was absolutely unleavened. We need to look at the context.
So here's a summary for Luke's Emmaus account. Remember, the Greek word for unleavened is azumos. It's unleavened, uncorrupted, especially the Passover week. And I'm sure many wonder why Luke's account for the unleavened bread eaten on Abib 18 was not linked to G106, azumos. Why not? The New Testament uses the word G106 azumos for unleavened more in connection with the festival than with the type of bread. And there is a reason for this, and we're going to examine it. So let's return to the fourth day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
The Greek word for unleavened, as you already know, is azumos. In Hebrew, it's matzah. On the fourth day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the bread being broken by Yahusha is azumon. There is very likely no leavened bread artos in the whole land of Israel for the entire 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread. They would have matzah. In Luke's account, the surviving Greek texts read artos, which is the common word for normal leavened bread. And this appears to be a simple oversight by those who copied or translated the original text. There are many variations of the New Testament writings where the best Greek word was replaced with a very similar Greek word that was more in accord with the local language when the manuscript was copied. So what is Koine Greek? What is it? The Greek dialect aimed at the common people is called Koine. When there seems to be a conflict, as there seems to be here in the account with Luke, then the full and proper understanding must be taken back to the Torah and the Hebrew definitions. These variations in the Greek text do not always degrade the text, but rather they help us to understand why it is important to choose the definition that fits the context and the content of every verse when there seems to be a discrepancy. So we're ready for a summary for Luke's Emmaus account. We're concluding this now. Even though the Greek word for bread, artos, holds the definition of leavened bread, it is the context of this passage that overrules that definition. Here's a little key. Context is always king. Any follower of Yahusha would not be serving leavened bread on a day in the midst of the 7-day feast of unleavened bread. And we can be thankful for Luke recording this event on the road to Emmaus. He's the only one that records many, many scriptures. This one testimony is the red flag that sets everything straight. Otherwise, you know what? It would be so easy to say the leavened bread represented Yahusha's flesh with our sins. But remember, our sins do not make his flesh sinful.
So now we'll take a look at conclusions here regarding bread in both Hebrew and Greek. The Hebrew word for bread, lechem, is used for both leavened and unleavened bread. And the Greek word for bread, artos, also refers to both leavened and unleavened bread. Therefore, to understand if bread is leavened or unleavened, then first, the Hebrew and Greek definitions cannot always stand alone. Remember context. We must give serious consideration to context. And scriptural patterns of type and antitype, they help give full alignment too. And all three steps are important to help us find the true definition of a passage. And so a general summary for this section. We have seen several times where the Greek word artos is used to identify both leavened and unleavened bread. And this very same word, artos, it is mentioned in the account of the Last Supper. And so far, it has been shown the Hebrew definition of the word lechem is not strictly unleavened bread unless there's a qualifier, unless it uses a qualifier combined with matzah. And likewise, lechem is not strictly leavened bread unless it's combined with the qualifier here, chametz. In Greek, azumos, that is the best word to indicate unleavened bread if the text would not use Koine Greek. We will consider now the verifying factor of type and antitype patterns after taking a careful look at the Last Supper in the four Gospels.
So we needed all of that workup to understand what is going to be happening in this second witness, which is going to use the word artos in this bread study. In John's Gospel, there's going to be a report of the second sitting at the supper table. Yes, there was two sittings. He talks about the second sitting.
Connecting the Emmaus testimony to the Last Supper. In Luke's Emmaus account, the Hebrew word for bread was not translated into the Greek as azumos to indicate unleavened bread. The Greek used the word artos that can take on either definition of leavened or unleavened bread. There was bread present at the Last Supper, but as to leavened or unleavened, this is not to be determined by observing only the Greek definitions used for bread. And with a careful look at the account given in John, perhaps this questionable area will reveal to us another clear answer by again considering the context and the scriptural patterns. So, things to watch for in the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do record Yahusha breaking and blessing artos bread, which appears to be leavened bread. But John is different. John does not record Yahusha breaking or blessing artos bread. In fact, John doesn't record anything about the supper table where the bread and drink emblems were offered by Yahusha in remembrance of him. And it is extremely important for us to take note of this stark omission by John. Why didn't he document this important information?
That's a good question, and we're going to find out the answer. John has some other information. Just a reminder, John records nothing about the event where the bread and drink were given to the disciples. After supper was ended, Yahusha washed the feet of all 12 disciples. Then he returned to his place at that supper table, and it says he sat down again. Only then does John record 740 artos bread in connection with giving it to Judas, who accepts. This artos bread was not blessed, and it was not broken by Yahusha. John does not record that Yahusha ate any of it, but merely the fact that Judas was going to accept this artos bread in his presence. And a few verses later, John connects this artos bread with the sop that was dipped in a very interesting way. But before we look at everything, we have some questions to ponder first. We have some things to think about before, during, and after reading the four gospel accounts. Number one, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, artos bread that Yahusha blessed and broke and gave to all, representing his broken perfect body. Was this really leavened bread, as the Greek definition suggests, or was it unleavened bread according to those scriptural patterns? Number two, did Judas eat of this bread at the Last Supper ordinance? Number three, we will compare the synoptic gospels to John. He shows that the artos bread, also described as a sop, or just a morsel of bread, a small bite or a mouthful, this sop was dipped by Yahusha until soaking wet and then given to Judas, and it was not blessed. Was this leavened bread, as the Greek definition suggests, or was it unleavened bread? And where are the scriptural patterns for the context? That's what we're looking for. And number four, why didn't the other disciples get any of this dipped bread if it was so special? Number five, after the foot washing, which disciples in the group were spiritually clean or spiritually unclean according to Yahusha's words? In other words, which disciples would be considered unleavened from sin or leavened with sin even though they had all taken part in the bread and the drink emblems. Remember the scriptural types and antitypes? When Yahusha compares the bread and the drink emblems to himself, what kind of bread would he have used for that divine comparison? And also remember, when it comes to the use of the Greek word artos bread, context must be king. So now we are ready to examine the four Gospels. We're going to go through them in quite a bit of detail. The first one will be Matthew 26, 20 to 25. I want you to notice here, he has 11 verses. I want you to notice how many verses Matthew, Mark, and Luke use to describe this event, and we'll compare that to what John does. I'm going to have a column here on the left side and with some extra notes on the right side. We'll go through it together. Verse 20. Now when the even was come, he sat down with the 12. Well, what do we learn here? Yahusha sits down with his 12 disciples. In verse 21, it says, and as they did eat, he said, verily I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. I want you to notice, this is important, one of you will betray me. And they were exceedingly sorrowful, and they began, every one of them, to say, Master, is it I? Every one of them asked, is it I? And he answered and said, he that dippeth his hand with me in the dish, the same shall betray me. Don't forget that, okay? The Son of Man goeth as it is written of him, but woe unto that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It had been good for that man if he had not been born. Then Judas, which betrayed him, answered and said, Master, is it I? And Yahusha said unto him, thou hast said. I want you to look at this comment. Judas asked if he was the betrayer. The answer is yes. But the question is, did Yahusha answer in such a way as to expose Judas to the whole group? We're going to find out about that. Let's continue with Matthew 26. And as they were eating, Yahusha took bread, artos, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to his disciples, and said, take, eat, this is my body. And the question is, would Yahusha really use leavened bread to represent his body that had absolutely no leaven of sin? Verse 27, and he took the cup and gave thanks, and gave it to them, saying, drink ye all of it. And I have a comment here. Most understand that the grape juice in the cup was unfermented or unleavened to represent the blood of our sinless Messiah. Also notice it just says the cup. Luke is going to tell us what was in the cup. He's the only one. Verse 28, for this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say unto you, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine here until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out into the Mount of Olives. I have to correct my mistake. Yahusha is saying here in verse 29, I will not drink this fruit of the vine. I'm sorry, I made that mistake. I have heard that some people believe that this was water in the cup because water does not leaven. Okay, so this is where Matthew clears it up. And there is no record of foot washing given in the account of Matthew. Well, let's look at Mark 14. Mark is one of my favorite books as well. Verses 17 to 21. He's got 10 verses here. I don't know why I've got 10 with 17 to 21, but anyway. And in the evening, he cometh with the 12. Okay, so once again, he's telling us, just like Matthew, Yahusha is sitting down with 12 disciples. And as he sat and did eat, Yahusha said, verily I say unto you, one of you which eateth with me shall betray me. Okay, we heard that from Matthew as well. And they began to be sorrowful and say unto him one by one, is it I? And another said, it is I. Remember, Matthew told us the same thing. Everyone asked, is it I? And he answered and said unto them, it is one of the 12 that dippeth with me in the dish. Didn't Matthew tell us the same thing? There was going to be one who was going to betray. And the Son of Man indeed goeth as is written with him, but woe to the man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. Good were it for that man if he had never been born. And Mark also does not have any record of the foot washing. Okay, we're going to finish off these last 10 verses that are given in Mark. And as they did eat, Yahusha took bread, its artos, and blessed and brake it, and gave it to them, and said, Take, eat, this is my body. And again, the question, what kind of bread would really represent the unleavened, sinless body of Yahusha? Verse 23, and he took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank. And again, what kind of drink in the cup would represent the unleavened blood of Yahusha's body? Leavened or unleavened, because there's a lot of people that say you can use leavened wine in that cup. And he said unto them, This is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many. Verily I say unto you, I will drink no more of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of heaven. Okay, we've got another confirmation here about the fruit of the vine. This is not water. And when they had sung a song, sung a hymn, they went out into the Mount of Olives. So that is Mark's account. Let's continue on with Luke. He's got 10 verses to look at. And when the hour was come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles were with him. Okay, we've read that many times. Matthew and Mark say the same thing. And he said unto them, With desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. And we've examined that in the other part. That is a very special phrase there. For I say unto you, I will not any more eat thereof until it be fulfilled in the kingdom of Yahuwah. And he took the cup and gave thanks and said, Take this and divide it among yourselves. Luke records that the drink of the cup is divided in preparation for drinking later. For I say unto you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of Elohim shall come. Continuing on in verse 19, and he took bread, this is artos, and he gave thanks and brake it and gave it unto them, saying, This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. So for verse 19, we have the same questions. Same questions apply as before for the bread and the drink. Would only the fruit of the vine be unleavened to represent the sinless Savior and not the bread? Verse 20, likewise also the cup after supper, saying, This cup is the New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you. And then the drink is going to be taken. But behold, the hand of him that betrayeth me is with me on the table. So what's Luke doing? He's saying there's a betrayer, just like Matthew and Mark. And truly the Son of Man goeth as it was determined, but woe unto that man by whom he is betrayed. And they began to inquire among themselves which of them it was that should do this thing. Again, they're all wondering, who is the betrayer? No record of foot washing, not in Luke either. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all kind of about the same. All right? All using 10 or 11 verses to describe this incredible event. Now we're going to look at John. We'll start out with verses 1 to 5, but I want to show you John is using 31 verses to describe what is happening here. Something different is going on. John does not specifically mention the bread and the drink at that first sitting of the supper table. He begins when the Last Supper event has ended. And there could have been just a regular supper. This is a regular meal. And then they had the drink and the bread emblems. Okay, but anyway, this is something happening after this supper sitting. It was the supper where the unleavened bread and the drink emblems were given to the disciples, as far as I can detect. And only John records the foot washing. This is important as well. In verse 1, he says, Now before the feast of the Passover, when Yahusha knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. I have a little note here. Judas is specifically mentioned at the very beginning of this account when the Last Supper event was ended. Very interesting. Verse 3, Yahusha, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come from Elohim and went to Elohim, he riseth from supper and laid aside his garments and took a towel and girded himself. So we have this account by John that he is rising from the supper table to wash all of the disciples' feet. Remember, Judas is there. After that, he poureth water into a basin, and he began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. And don't forget, Yahusha is washing the feet of 12 disciples. He's the only one that records this. Then cometh he to Simon Peter, and Peter saith unto him, Master, dost thou wash my feet? And Yahusha answered and said unto him, What I do thou knowest not now, but thou shalt know hereafter. And Peter saith unto him, Thou shalt never wash my feet. And Yahusha answered him, If I wash thee not, thou hast no part of me. And Simon Peter saith unto him, he changed his mind, didn't he? Master, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. And Yahusha saith to Peter, He that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet, but he is clean every whit. And ye are clean, but not all. Look what happens. John is giving us the first clue. There is a betrayer in the group. Verse 11, For he knew who should betray him. Therefore said he, Ye, he's talking about Judas, are not all clean. So John's giving you another clue here. There's a betrayer in the group. So after he had washed their feet and had taken his garments and was set down again, he said unto them, Know ye what I have done to you? Okay, second time that Yahusha is at the table. Note, this is likely a round table according to how the following events are going to be recorded. I want you to notice what happens because only John records this. He says, You call me teacher and master, and you say, Well, for so I am. If I then, your teacher and master, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. And so right here in verses 15 and 16, we have the instructions for the ordinance of foot washing that we like to include along with the drink and the bread ordinances. In verse 16, he continues, Verily, verily, I say unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord, neither he that is sent greater than he that sent him. If you know these things, happy are ye if you do them. I speak not of you all. I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled. He that eateth bread, this is artos, he that eateth artos with me, lifted up his heel against me. He's talking about Judas, but he hasn't said anything. And this is the eating of this bread, okay? Verse 18 has a clue, second clue that there's a betrayer in the group. Now I tell you before it come, that when it come to pass, ye may believe that I am he. Verily, verily, I say unto you, that he that receiveth whomsoever I send receiveth me, and he that receiveth me receiveth him that sent me. Verse 21, When Yahusha had thus said, he was troubled in spirit, and testified, and said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. Everyone, third clue, there's a betrayer in the group. Verse 22, Then the disciples looked one on another, doubting of whom he spake. You know what? No other gospel writer reports that the disciples did not know who the betrayer was. No other gospel. Verse 23, Now there was leaning on Yahusha's bosom one of his disciples whom Yahusha loved. You do the study? That's John. I want you to note the John's position with Yahusha, leaning on his bosom. Okay? It's very close to Yahusha. Now, verse 24. Simon Peter therefore beckoned to him, who would have been John, that he should ask who it is that he is speaking about. I want you to notice Peter urges John to find out who the betrayer is, since he's the closest in position. I think Peter must have been across from the table to make eye contact with John. Remember, Peter and John are really close companions. Probably looked at him, nodded like, get on with it. Ask him, find out who it is. He, John, then laying on Yahusha's breast, saying unto him, do you think he would have said, Master, who is it? Or do you think he would have said, Master, who is it? Do you think John would have silently asked the question? You're going to find out shortly. Yahusha answered, do you think he said, he it is to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it? And when he had dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. Or do you think Yahusha answers John quietly to not expose the betrayer by name? Do you think Yahusha said to John, it is he who I'm going to give the sop to when I've dipped it? Do you think he said it quietly so nobody else heard? There was dipped sop involved. Judas must have been sitting on the other side of Yahusha. Verse 27, and after the sop, Satan entered into him. Then saith Yahusha unto him, that thou doest, do quickly. Everyone, fourth clue, there is a betrayer in the group. Now verse 28, now listen. No man at the table knew for what intent Yahusha spoke this unto Judas. John is the only one that records that none of the other disciples know why Judas leaves the group. For some of them thought, very important word, some of them thought because Judas had the bag that Yahusha had said unto him, buy those things that we have need of against the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. And yet here in verse 29, Yahusha still does not expose Judas for who he really is, but he only tells him to act quickly. Verse 30, and then having received the sop, went immediately out, and it was night. Everyone, fifth clue, there is a betrayer in the group, and Judas leaves. Therefore, when he was gone out, Yahusha said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and Elohim is glorified in him. Well, let's take our study back to the bread, because we're trying to figure out what's going on here with this bread.
So when we look at Luke 22:19, bread, again, is artos. We remember from the Emmaus account. And he took bread, artos, and gave thanks, and brake it, and gave unto them, saying, this is my body. And there are several issues that should be taken note of right here. Okay? The definition of the Greek word artos does not indicate only leavened bread, because we already know that this word is also used for unleavened bread. And remember, there is a Greek word that could have been used for unleavened bread. It is the word azumos, and the translators did not make this choice. And in part 1 of this study, it was determined that the Last Supper was the day before the Passover festival. And at this point in time, everyone is still allowed to eat leavened bread if they want to. However, with that being said, the Jews that were preparing for the Passover festival, which was arriving, likely they still had a good supply of leavened products in their dwelling places on Abib 13, including unleavened bread, cakes, and wafers that would have been prepared or purchased for the spring festival. And a study on leaven most often represents, again, the leaven of sin. However, remember, leaven can also represent leaven for the kingdom of heaven.
But not all are clean. There were two groups of people after the foot washing, most in a clean condition, or unleavened, and one in a filthy condition, basically leavened with sin. In John 13:10-11, Yahusha saith to him, He that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet, but is clean every whit, and ye are clean, but not all. For he knew who should betray him, therefore he said, Ye are not all clean. And even though all 12 disciples had their feet washed by Yahusha, the betrayer was still leavened with sin. But you know, John will be different. John's account of the Last Supper is a bit different than Matthew, Mark, or Luke. In John's account of the Last Supper, there is only one verse that uses this word bread, artos. It's verse 18. I speak not of you all. I know whom I have chosen, but that the scripture may be fulfilled. He that eateth artos with me hath lifted up his heel against me. There is no written account that Yahusha ate or drank anything that evening. However, one of the disciples that was with him accepted this artos and he ate it. There's documentation coming for that. It is interesting that John has not given a detailed account of the actual bread that Yahusha gave to all of his disciples with those ordinances. But in verse 18, he mentions the bread from the second sitting of the supper table in connection with that betrayer. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not mention the bread given to the betrayer. However, all three of them mention the bread that was eaten in remembrance of their master at that first sitting.
So now it's time to remember. The Greek word artos attempts to describe the unleavened bread of Torah. And in the Synoptic Gospels, it appears artos is used to describe Yahusha's body, which was given or broken for us, which we know was without sin, without leaven. And note, just because it appears the Synoptic Gospels are talking about leavened bread, do we really dare question if this is really bread with leaven? So we'll take a look at gospel comparisons here. Matthew, Mark, and Luke write about Yahusha sitting at the supper table just one time. But not John. Remember, John records sitting at the supper table 2 distinct times. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not record the foot washing ceremony, where John, he does record that Yahusha washes all of the disciples' feet, including Judas. And in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Yahusha gives only one clue of who the betrayer is. In John, 5 clues are given of the betrayer. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record bread being broken at the supper table, and none of them record the sop being dipped. But John is very different. John does not record bread being broken at the first supper table, but he does mention the betrayal ate bread in his presence at the first supper table. John does not talk about the sop being dipped with the betrayer at the second sitting of the supper table after the foot washing ceremony. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem to indicate that all the disciples knew that Judas was the betrayer. Yet John, he makes it clear that Yahusha did not expose or embarrass Judas to the whole group, but rather he gave Judas every opportunity to confess and repent of his planned deed.
And with all of that, we need to take a closer look at John. Let's consider the details in John a little more closely and see if there is another option to this controversy over the bread. In verse 26, it says, Yahusha answered, He it is to whom I shall give a sop. This is 5596. When I have dipped it, that's 911, and when he had dipped that sop, that is a different number, 1686. When he had dipped the sop, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. Let's look at the word sop. is G5596. Look what it says, a crumb or a morsel. It's a mouthful, okay? It's just something small. Sop, 5596. This first word, dip, is 911. It's bapto. It's to overwhelm, to cover wholly with a fluid, only in a qualified or specially sense. Interesting that that word in the New Testament, that it has qualified in the definition, literally to moisten, okay, to stain, dip, 911. But there is another dipped. It's 1686. It's embapto, and it means to whelm on, to get wet, okay, to be in contact with a fluid. In other words, to dip long enough for that item to be soaking wet, not just moistened. John does a double duty here. He makes sure you know that this is going to be soaking wet.
So now we have some semi-final conclusions here. In part 1 of this study, we found this Last Supper did indeed take place on Abib 13. And the disciples, they were asked to prepare for the Passover. They would have purchased some unleavened bread for the Passover meal they were planning to eat on Abib 14. And the local homes could still be cleaned of leaven on Abib 14 before the Passover meal that night. And there was no command to rid unleavened products on Abib 13. And therefore, having leavened bread at the table, that was used by Yahusha to dip the sop for Judas. That was not an issue. However, Yahusha would not and did not use leavened bread to represent his body at the first sitting of this table. And according to definitions for the sop that was dipped, it would have been a leavened morsel of bread that had soaked up a lot of the dip. Only Judas received this sop, indicating he was indeed totally leavened with sin.
Yes, John has the final word. In John's Gospel, which was written about 90 to 100 AD, this was long after the Synoptic Gospels were written. John's focus was to take the message of the Messiah to the Gentile world that was under Roman rule, and also to the unbelieving Jews. His work would have been translated into Greek, as the majority, if not all, of the Gentile world did not read Hebrew. The Koine Greek was used to translate the Hebrew, often not supplying the words or the terms for the full and proper understanding. This is very evident through the use of artos to define both leavened and unleavened bread. And while this may seem like a small detail, there is a huge difference in these final meanings. You know what? John is very careful in his record of how he uses the word bread. By the time he compiled his gospel, he must have realized the problem in the synoptic writings. John uses terminology for the Last Supper that removes any trace of linking leavened artos bread with his master, Yahusha. John is the only one that records that not one of the rest of the disciples knew exactly who the betrayer was, except himself. And isn't that the sweet way of Yahusha? To gently give every opportunity to the erring one for repentance, and should that not happen, to not deliberately expose and embarrass that individual to a whole host of others. So we have 2 supper tables. What is the summary? In the Synoptic Gospels, we have that first supper table of the bread and the drink offerings, the ordinances. And then seems like it goes on to the foot washing service, and that connects the 2 events between these 2 supper tables. John's account is talking about the sitting at the supper table, the second sitting at the table, where the sop came into the picture. In the first supper table, Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us about the breaking of artos bread, receiving the drink, one mention of the betrayer in the group, an appearance that everybody knows who the betrayer is, and no mention of leaving the supper table for the foot washing. And remember, each of them use an average of 10 or 11 verses to record the events of this first supper table. But the second sitting at the supper table, oh, that's with John. John uses 31 verses to record the events of the Second Supper table. His record is very different. He records this event is before the Passover, so it is not the Passover meal. He only records the First Supper of emblems has ended. There is no mention of the breaking of artos or receiving the drink. Mentions Judas specifically when the First Supper is ended, the others do not, and only John records the foot washing after the First Supper with emblems. And then John records Yahusha sat at the supper table again for the second time. That Second Supper table, yes, John is different, using 31 verses. He has 5 statements that declare that there is a betrayer in the group, and nobody knows who the betrayer is except John. The disciples felt that Judas had special regard, as only he received that dip sop. And the only time that John uses the term artos, mostly referring to leavened bread, is after the foot washing at the Second Supper table. This artos was leavened sop. It was thoroughly dipped, and it was given to only Judas. Only John records that Judas removed himself from the group, leaving 11. And remember, most of them thought that Judas was preparing something for the feast that was yet to come. Why is John's gospel so different? The following are just some thoughts and questions for further consideration around the controversial bread in this study of the Last Supper. Remember the fact? The Synoptic Gospels and Acts were written well in advance of John, varying from 40 to 69 AD. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were trying to reach the unconverted Jews with the gospel of the true Messiah, and Paul was the apostle chosen to take the gospel to the true Messiah to the Gentiles. Another fact, John's gospel was written between 90 to 100 AD, over 20 to 50 years later. One of the disciples and apostles, of all of them, John was the longest living eyewitness, and I believe by the time he wrote his gospel, he was focusing on the Roman and Gentile community. We know this as he used Roman reckoning of time for only the Passion account. John was obviously determined that his true Messiah was not to be confused with any other counterfeit Messiah. Could it be that John deliberately did not write about the events at the First Supper table because the Koine Greek word artos could not properly describe the unleavened bread Yahusha used at the first sitting of the supper table? And I'm asking the question, why? Artos is the first understood as leavened bread by definition and by the Greek-Roman mindset. Artos, leavened bread, does not rightly represent the flesh of John's perfect and true Messiah. Azumos is the best word. To absolutely verify bread would be unleavened, but likely not the best word for the Greeks to understand the whole concept, as this was not a common word. Could it be these are the reasons that John deliberately chose to avoid recording the events around the unleavened bread and drink? He was not going to take any chances that any of this was misunderstood. Well, that finishes the second witness. We're going to go on to the third witness for this artos bread study. It's about the patterns of the type and the antitype. Remember, the type is equal to the shadow of the true, and the antitype is going to represent the true.
So leavened bread conflicts. There are some that feel leavened bread could also represent Yahusha's body, as the drink represents his blood. A lot of Christian denominations will serve leavened. And Yahusha said, though, we are to partake of the bread as a representation of his body and the drink as a representation of his blood. Some feel the bread can or must be leavened because the Greek word artos is defined as leavened bread. Does that mean the drink can also be leavened? Or is one leavened and one unleavened? Matthew's Hebrew translation, it uses the word lechem for bread. In Hebrew, this lechem can also have dual definitions. Is this likely the reason the Greek translation used artos rather than azumos? In this study, we've discovered that both lechem and artos easily can take on both meanings of either leavened or unleavened. So how can this conflict be solved or settled?
We're just going to take one little look at type and antitype. Would not the type and the antitype have the last word on the final answer to this bread controversy? Well, let's dig a little deeper to find how the type has to link to the antitype for complete fulfillment in Yahusha, the true Messiah. We're just going to use a few examples here today. There's many. So remember, the type is the shadow that points to the true. Antitype is the true. So in the type, the lamb is the Passover sacrifice, okay? And it's accompanied by a grain offering. And Yahusha is the true lamb for the Passover, and he represents his body as the brain of the grain offering. He has to fulfill that grain offering. In the drink offering as the type that was poured out at the altar or sometimes on the sacrifices themselves, he has to use the grape juice as the drink offering that represents his blood, the blood of the vine, the blood of the grape. He has to fulfill that as well. The sacrifices were always accompanied with grain offering and drink offerings on the altar of burnt offering. Those always went together with the sacrifices, morning and evening. What about Yahusha? His pierced and striped flesh represents that grain offering. His spilled blood represents the drink offering. And Yahusha's stake was his altar of burnt offering. So he fulfills those very things.
Now we're going to take a look at Exodus 34, verse 25 in the book of the law, in the instructions for leaven. Note that in Exodus 32, the people had just violated the covenant with the golden calf offense. And in Exodus 34:25 is a very short, stern reminder after Moses' last trip down Mount Sinai of what not to do regarding leaven. Idol worship links to paganism and sin. So does offering leaven with blood sacrifices. Therefore, this command was given before the sanctuary was set up. It says, "You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leaven, nor shall the sacrifice of the feast of the Passover be left until morning." And this command is for all blood sacrifices on any altar, not just the altar of burnt offerings. And there'll be more details in Leviticus 2 from the book of the law. Scriptural requirements for the grain offerings in Leviticus 2. It says, "When anyone offers a grain offering to Yahuwah, his offering shall be of fine flour, and he shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it." And salt is also a requirement. "He shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priests, and the priest shall burn it as a memorial on the altar, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to Yahuwah. It is most holy of the offerings to Yahuwah, made by fire. Baked in oven, it shall be unleavened cakes of fine flour mixed with oil, or unleavened wafers anointed with oil, and baked in a pan, it shall be of fine flour, unleavened, mixed with oil." So the unleavened grain offering is a type to be fulfilled in Messiah. Now, scriptural reference requirements continuing, "You shall break it in pieces and pour oil on it. It is a grain offering. Baked in a covered pan, it shall be made of fine flour with oil. You shall bring the grain offering to the priest. He shall bring it to the altar. Then the priest shall take from the grain offering a memorial portion and burn it on the altar. And what is left of the grain offering shall be Aaron's and his sons. It is most holy of the offerings to Yahuwah made by fire." Again, the unleavened bread or the unleavened grain offering is offered with the blood sacrifice. "No grain offering which you bring to Yahuwah shall be made with leaven, for you shall burn no leaven, nor any honey in any offering to Yahuwah made by fire. So these detailed instructions are found in the book of the law. However, they were first given in the book of the covenant, and we're going to examine Exodus 23:18.
Yes, Exodus 23:18 is Book of the Covenant instructions, and here they are for the leaven. You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, nor shall the fat of my sacrifice remain until the morning. What about the law of peace offerings? There's something going on there as well in Leviticus 7. The peace offerings could be known as a thanksgiving offering or a heave offering, had many different titles. This is the law of the sacrifice of peace offerings, which he shall offer to Yahuwah. If he offers it for a thanksgiving, then he shall offer with the sacrifice of thanksgiving unleavened cakes mixed with oil, unleavened wafers anointed with oil, or cakes of blended flour mixed with oil. Besides the cakes as his offering, he shall offer leavened bread with the sacrifice of thanksgiving of his peace offering. And from it he shall offer one cake from each offering as a heave offering to Yahuwah. It shall belong to the priest who sprinkles the blood of the peace offering. Did you see the leavened bread offering belonged to the priest? Did you notice that? You know what? The peace offerings are unique. This sacrifice was offered in times of thankfulness, peace, joy, a promise or a vow, health, safety, redemption. If you had something to be happy about and praiseworthy, you could have a thanksgiving offering or a peace offering. And a portion of that sacrifice was always given to the priest, along with several varieties of unleavened breads and cakes, and the rest of the offering was for the offerer, his family, neighbors, guests, and for the poor. It was to be eaten within 2 days, enjoying the feast and the fellowship together, nothing lacking, and anything left over beyond the specified time was to be burnt. Being eaten meant the majority of this sacrifice was not offered upon the altar. However, besides the unleavened requirements, the offerer was also to bring leavened bread. Remember, 2 different kinds, which is particular to only this offering, but never, never was leavened bread offered on the altar, for that was forbidden in Leviticus 2:11. The leavened bread was to be eaten with the flesh of the sacrifice, so that the meal would be most pleasant for all. Why? Because leavened bread was more desirable, it even is today, for many people.
So the strict requirements for grain offerings on the altar of burnt offering. Let's be sure that we realize the leaven requirement attached to the peace offering is unique, and that this leaven was never offered on the altar of burnt offering according to Leviticus 2, verse 11. Remember, no grain offering which you bring to Yahuwah shall be made with leaven, for you shall burn no leaven, nor any honey in any offering to Yahuwah made by fire. And these detailed instructions are found in the book of the law. However, they were first given in the book of the covenant. And we read that in Exodus 23:18, the book of the covenant for leaven, you shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, nor shall the fat of my sacrifice remain until morning. Let us never assume that Yahusha would ever describe his flesh as being likened to leavened bread.
And now we come to some final conclusions. Leavened bread should never be used when celebrating the ordinances of the Last Supper. 3 witnesses testify to this. In Luke 24:30, this Emmaus account, the bread in this verse was definitely unleavened, despite the fact that the Greek term artos was used, which usually represents leavened bread. Remember, context was king. Look at the context. In John 13:18, the bread in this verse used the Greek term artos as well, But this is correct, as the context is in the connection with the artos sop given to the leavened Judas. Point number 3, we have those patterns of type and antitype from both the Book of the Covenant and the Book of the Law. There are explicit instructions that no leaven is ever placed on the altar with the blood sacrifices to mar the identity of our true Messiah. And what do I say from Luke, John, type and antitype, Matthew and Mark? Choose ye this day. That is the end of this, what we call part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, you'll want to see that. We just want to thank you so much for being with us today on this Shabbat. If you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@studythecalendar.com. You can find the studies there at the website. We just want to thank you for being with us today, and Shalom.